to start off, I'm Patrick Boyle with the Water Security Agency, and just before I begin here, a little bit of background on myself. I grew up 11 miles southeast of Moose Jaw on a grain farm, and we still have a farm there today. And so we had the same year as everybody else, and got a little bit lucky in some areas on our canola this year. And so that's kind of just a background for me. I'm also like a recovering municipal politician. I was a city councilor in Moose Jaw for a couple of years after we moved in from the farm here recently. So I always like to know who I'm talking to a little bit at the end of the day. So I certainly appreciate being a farm kid. Appreciate everybody in this call here today, and thanks for coming and inviting us here. So with me, I'll just do a quick introduction. Is obviously Dwayne Gelowitz, and he was introduced, but also with Dwayne is Jerry Gross, who's part of the team that Dwayne's working with. And I'd have to be remiss if I didn't mention Jerry here. I think is on this call with us here today, and so thanks for that, Jerry, and for joining us. And just for this project here, I'll start off just an introduction, and then I'll let Dwayne get into the presentation and take over here. And just for everybody, this journey kind of started, I guess you would say, depending on who you talk to, July 2020 is the real start of it. But the reality is what we're talking about is something that's been roughly 50 years in the making. So from our perspective, it's on the government's end of things, we're excited about this project, and this presentation is kind of general information. It's early days in the development of this, and when you look at those things, it's there's a lot more work ahead of us on this whole project, and to move it forward and do it the right way for everybody. So that's what we're looking at is really what we call the Lake Diefenbaker irrigation projects, or essentially three projects that are the west side rehabilitation, the west side expansion, and then the third would be the Qu'Appelle South water conveyance project. And really what we're focused on right now is on the west side projects, and looking at the rehabilitation, what's already there with the existing canal system and pump station, and then also the expansion, which would go further north of Conquest in that area, which many of you are familiar as you get closer to Saskatoon about that. So what I'm going to turn it over to Dwayne here shortly is to kind of walk us through some information that's at a higher level of kind of where the project is, where we're going, and kind of what the future looks like. So with that, I'll turn it over to Mr. Gelowitz. Dwayne, go ahead.
Thank you very much, Patrick. And what I'll say is throughout my presentation, if Patrick wants to jump in or Jerry wants to jump in, to comment or support some of the things I'm saying, you're very welcome to jump in and comment, similar to what we might have done previously at some open houses that we attended. My name is Dwayne Gelowitz. I'm the project director for the Prime Consultant team, and the lead of the Prime team is Clifton Engineering Group. And certainly we're very pleased to have with us on our team both the Associated Engineering and Stantec. So those are the prime partners for our consulting team. So some of you may or may not have seen or participated in the open houses that we held late July in Delisle and Outlook, and this is going to very much parallel the information that we presented at that time. And certainly, if you have questions at the end, we'll be happy to address any questions, and maybe we'll walk through this, and a lot of the questions you might have might be answered during the presentation. One of the things Patrick mentioned is that this is early days. We don't have all the answers yet, but we will be working towards the answers and looking to address any questions or concerns that people may have. So as Patrick mentioned, we're talking about the West Side irrigation projects, and these are the first two projects out of the Lake Diefenbaker irrigation projects. So one of the things we need to recognize is that when we're dealing with any type of major development, First Nations and Métis rights are paramount. And certainly as we are going forward with this project, one of the main components of our project is to work with First Nations and Métis to understand their rights, their concerns, whether they have any traditional territory within the project area, what uses they may have of the land within that project area. The image in front of you right now basically shows the project area shown in the light green for the west side, stretching from Lake Diefenbaker up towards the North Saskatchewan River. And it doesn't look like a big area on the map, but I can tell you it's a vast project area. And you can see a lot of the Métis locals and First Nations and their proximity to the project. And as part of our initial reach out to First Nations and Métis, we had an invitational open house with them at Dakota Dunes. So as part of any regulatory process, First Nations and Métis involvement and discussions on engagement and ultimately duty to consult if triggered become a major portion of any regulatory project. So why are we talking about irrigation? Well, many of you understand that back in the dirty 30s, there was serious repercussions from drought in the province. And that triggered a lot of thoughts about how can that be mitigated. And the PFRA, as you know, was created to lead a transformation of farming and water management practices in the province in response to the dirty 30s. Currently, as a result of that, we have about 110,000 acres of irrigated land from Lake Diefenbaker, and the West Side Irrigation Project looks to expand that capacity by up to an additional 340,000 acres. So certainly we are looking to see how we can mitigate and provide resiliency and crop security, food security going forward as part of this project. This is probably not that relevant for this team, but it's understanding irrigation. Some of the stakeholders may or may not even understand what irrigation means. Certainly, irrigation means providing supplemental water for crops during dry periods so that we can have good crop production irrespective of what the drought or environmental conditions might be in the project area. Certainly, we're looking for increased crop yields, diversity of crops, maybe bringing crops into production that currently aren't growable in the climate that we have, just because there is a shortage of water, and whether we can look at some of those crops for value-added production and economic growth within the province. So what are some of those crops? Some of the ones that have been identified and that are talked about by producers are potatoes, corn, carrots, table crops, berries, all those types of things that can provide value-added production and expand our economic base within the province. One of the things about irrigation and the focuses of our team is to make sure that we are dealing with systems that efficiently apply water throughout the project area at a rate that matches the crop needs, and that the intake capacity of the soils is not exceeded, and that we minimize runoff and water losses. One of the mottos of our team is that we're trying to make every drop count. And with the shortage of water that many of you are reading about and hearing about, I think that's very important for us to look at and address in our project, in the project going forward. So what are some of the benefits of irrigation? Let's look at the provincial benefits first. Certainly, there's a number of community benefits in terms of income, economic activities, supporting local communities throughout the project areas. There are many engineering and environmental activities that are currently being undertaken and that will need to be undertaken for the project going forward. And certainly, many of you have probably understand the significant construction requirements for this job. As announced by the province in July 2020, as Patrick said, there was about a $4 billion announcement in terms of the Lake Diefenbaker irrigation projects, including the West Side and the Quebec South Water Conveyance project. And certainly to build those, we're going to need many years of significant construction with approximately 2,500 person years of employment directly in the construction activities for the work. Operation and maintenance of a system like the West Side Irrigation Project is not inconsiderable, and there will be many opportunities and jobs related to operations and maintenance of the project on a go-forward basis. There's also many job opportunities for not only local irrigators and staffing for the farming, but also potential food processing industry growth that we might see or likely will see develop as part of the development of the irrigation expansion in the West Side. So economic value added is certainly one of the base assumptions that the project assumes will happen. Food security and crop diversity are certainly goals of the project, and to support livestock industry. Increased feed opportunities will support the growth and development of the livestock industry, and hopefully maybe reopen or start some food processing or livestock processing industries in the province again that have been shut down in the last decade or so. So the West Side Irrigation Project, once again, you see the light green area that represents the project limits, and certainly the soil conditions within this area are very suitable for irrigation. There's large blocks of irrigable soils that have been identified, and this map shows in the darker green within the project area some irrigation blocks that were identified previously and that are being validated by our project team as we go forward. One of the things in terms of our scope for the work is that we are looking to test and understand the soil suitability for irrigation throughout the project area. In the spring, we did about 12,000 acres of soil testing to support the understanding of the soil capabilities for irrigation. And in the fall, currently undergoing, there's about another 26 or 27,000 acres of soil testing that are being undertaken to fully understand, or to best understand as we can within the limitations of the project, what the soil capabilities are, what deficiencies, if any, there are, and how that might be managed or optimized going forward. Certainly understanding the magnitude or the amount of irrigable soils within the project area informs the sizing of the project infrastructure, the canals, the pump stations, so that we can make sure that the project is able to support the irrigation soils that are anticipated. And maybe I'll ask Jerry to maybe make a couple of comments at this point, just to elaborate on that.
Yeah, sure, I'll do that. Dwayne, Jerry Gross here. As Dwayne said, working as a consulting agrologist here with Clifton. Yeah, we've been really studying this area hard starting in the spring. We're doing, like Dwayne said, about 40,000 acres of the 340,000 acres in those blocks. We chose the corridors that we're doing based on soils associations and proximity to other associations, and to try to determine what is actually out there, if the potential is as stated by the UMA report in 2005, the group that created these blocks. We're actually going to see ground truth, what is out there. It's been a very interesting operation and very thorough. It's not a windshield survey. We're doing all the work to the level that the Ministry of Agriculture wants us to do using their guidelines, so that they can create a soil certificate for each quarter of land when we're done. So it's very detailed, EMM38 grids, soil sampling, correlation, georeferencing of the soil sampling to the grid, and being able to therefore make recommendations on irrigation. So as Dwayne said, we're well underway. We did 12,000 acres in the spring, the EM38 and the soil sampling. We're still processing that data, and then we're hitting the lab with a lot of samples this fall. We've got to get this job done so that the 40,000 acres we've gone over thoroughly provides our team with the information they need to move forward on potential designs and areas of interest. So that's what we're doing right as we speak.
Well, thank you, Jerry. And certainly we have gone out and requested permission from various landowners to undertake the soil testing in their quarter sections, and everything has been voluntary. The benefit to the landowners is once we are done, they do have a report of the soil conditions on their property, and if the land is irrigable, that report will permit them to go and get an irrigation certificate from agriculture at some point when this project is ultimately ready for water distribution and irrigation. So certainly it's voluntary and beneficial to the landowners to be part of this soil analysis, and it helps inform our project going forward. Okay, maybe we'll just move on a little bit, and certainly we can answer some questions about that later if there are any. The vision for 1952 and the first thoughts about the South Saskatchewan River Basin project was to irrigate about 455,000 acres of land in central Saskatchewan by constructing the dam on the South Saskatchewan River and creating Lake Diefenbaker. So certainly this project has a long history, and many people may not know, or it may have been lost through the history, is that the original purpose of the hydroelectric dam at the Caddo power station is that the power was being generated to support the irrigation project. And that was one of the primary purposes of the power generation at Gardner Dam to support the overall power consumption needs for pumping not only out of Lake Diefenbaker, but for pumping distribution within the project area to get the water to the lands. So I'm going to provide a brief breakdown of what we refer to as the rehabilitation project and the expansion project. Patrick talked about that a little bit at the beginning. Most of you may or may not know that this project actually started construction in the late 1960s, and that about 42 or 45 kilometers of canal were built in the late 60s and early 70s towards a facility referred to as the Conquest Reservoir. The project was never completed, and the Conquest Reservoir was partly completed and never actually put into service. And the canal, as I said, for 42 or 45 kilometers was complete and never fully put into service. In the late 1980s, the Macquarie Irrigation District obtained approvals to block off part of the canal at around kilometer 23 and fill that canal to irrigate about 3,000 acres in the Macquarie Irrigation District. When the project was abandoned, the substructure for the pump house at the Caddo Bay was partially completed. The substructure basically from ground level down was completed, but the work above, including the installation of the major pumps and the superstructure, was never completed. What happened when McCrory decided to take and develop part of the project was they put a small pump above the superstructure to provide water to fill the canal, which basically acts as a reservoir for irrigating those existing acres. So in terms of the project and how we're designating this right now, is we are considering the first 80,000 acres up to the Conquest Reservoir, or the originally planned Conquest Reservoir, to be part of the rehabilitation project. So the original project was designed or intended to irrigate about 80,000 acres of land as part of the rehabilitation project. And that amount of acres is what we're considering the rehabilitation project here. And anything beyond Conquest going north and towards the North Saskatchewan River is referred to as the expansion project. So the first 80,000 acres is in the rehab project, and the up to 260,000 acres in the expansion project is from Conquest Reservoir going north. So one of the things that we have to do in terms of the rehabilitation project is recognize that a lot of the infrastructure that was built in the 1960s and early 1970s is now 50 years old. It was built to 1960 standards. So even if we were to reinitiate the existing infrastructure, it would need to be upgraded and expanded to meet current design standards. The canal, originally designed in the rehabilitation project, was designed for 21 cubic meters per second to irrigate about 80,000 acres. If we are looking at 340,000 acres for the entire West Side expansion project, that relates to about 120 cubic meters per second and would require a significant expansion of the rehab canal to accommodate that flow going north towards the northern limits of the project. So as you can see on the map, the red line represents the approximate location of the current canal as it exists and what will be upgraded as part of the ongoing works. Sorry. So a number of features will need to be incorporated in the project. Certainly, this is an example of some of the things that we need to accommodate going forward in the project. Number one is an example of a typical reservoir. We're going to need to have one or more balancing reservoirs throughout the project to feed the distribution for the irrigation in the different irrigation soil blocks. We are going to need a number of control structures located along the canals to control flow levels and operate the system. Certainly, the typical crossings for highways and railways are represented on items 3 and 4. In many cases, especially as we're talking to the initial parts of the canal, these are likely going to need to be bridges just because of the size of the conveyance and the amount of water that we're going to need to convey under those features, and to minimize head losses as we move forward. And we see in the bottom rural road crossings and a typical canal. Certainly, those are things that will be part of the work that we're moving forward with. Figure number 7 is a typical example pump station. One of the things we have to recognize is that we're talking about a major pump station. To expand the flow to meet the full system requirements will need about 120 cubic meters per second. The rendering shown on the screen represents a type of station that could be used to provide that type of flow, with 10 bays, each producing about 12 cubic meters per second. And each of those pumps and bays can be installed as the demand for irrigation increases while soils are being pulled in, or the uptake for the soils is realized throughout the project. So why are we doing this project, or what are some of the benefits? Certainly, we talked about the impact on the project area, and growing Saskatchewan is certainly part of that. The figure on the top right represents population trends over the last 100 or so years. You can see that in various locations, the populations were certainly higher in the 1920s and decreasing over time to current times around 2006. One of the things that is interesting to see is that that trend is not indicative across the whole area. The two green lines that you see are areas that are represented by irrigation, RM 284 and Outlook, which have not followed the base trend, and in fact have bucked the trend and maintained population levels at or above their historical numbers. And certainly that is one of the benefits of having irrigation and advanced agriculture in many areas of the province. So what does it mean in terms of contribution to GDP? 1 acre of dryland wheat contributes about $400 to provincial GDP. If that acre of wheat is converted to irrigated potatoes, that number contributes about $5,500 to provincial GDP. And if we actually advance that and we start processing those potatoes, that contributes approximately $20,000 to provincial GDP for every acre that is realized. So the project is looking to accommodate or optimize the value of the land in the project area to provide these economic benefits, not only for the province at the farm, but to the local and provincial levels. So at the farm level, certainly we're talking about maximizing yields of conventional field crops, getting into additional non-conventional higher value crops, and securing feed for livestock industries as we go forward. At the local level, certainly there's increased employment, increased demand for crop inputs, retail distributors and agronomists, and increased need for irrigation equipment suppliers and service providers. And at the provincial level, certainly there's crop diversification and security, which will attract agricultural businesses and processors and provide growth in the livestock industry and attract processing facilities. And consumers can also purchase more locally grown products right from within Saskatchewan, as opposed to relying on California or other jurisdictions. So what about the water? People ask the question, well, is there enough water to support the project? There's two examples on the right-hand side of the screen that I'd like to draw your attention to. The top one shows water, cumulative water consumption and losses in a median flow year. There's a number of uses and consumption that are anticipated in a normal year. Certainly net evaporation, everybody recognizes, is a portion of the water consumption out of Lake Diefenbaker. And you see that on the far left. And as you go to the right, these are what are anticipated consumptions in a typical median year. Out of Lake Diefenbaker, some water is released down the Qu'Appelle currently and will be planned in the future for uses along the Qu'Appelle River system and for environmental purposes. The East Side Pump Station is also a user of water, which pumps water to existing irrigators. And then there's a line item called direct use. This is farms, consumers, industries that take water out of Diefenbaker for their various needs. The next jump is quite a large jump, and what you'll see that describe that as minimum flow. What is required as part of the operation of the South Saskatchewan River Basin is that there needs to be minimum flows maintained through the South Saskatchewan and ultimately North Saskatchewan River for environmental purposes, downstream uses, and a lot of this is dictated by the apportionment agreement between Alberta, Saskatchewan, and Manitoba. Alberta has the right to use 50% of all the water that comes into their boundaries or their borders from BC, from the mountains, and as well 50% of any water that's generated within Alberta for Alberta uses, including irrigation. Saskatchewan likewise has the right to use 50% of the water that comes into Saskatchewan or generated within Saskatchewan for downstream for internal uses, and these uses can support certainly irrigation and other needs. But we need to pass 50% of all that down through Manitoba and to Manitoba for their use and ultimately into the Hudson Bay. So when we talk about minimum flow, not only do we need to pass that 50% through, but we need to maintain minimum flows at all times down the river to make sure that the downstream users are accommodated and the environmental conditions are accommodated. So when you look then at the next two items on that graph, you see the Capel South Water Conveyance diversion and the estimated West Side Irrigation Project diversions. So those numbers, as you can see, are fairly small relative to the minimum flows that are required to be conveyed downstream. And the surplus that is above that green line and to the red line, which represents that median flow, is still quite substantial. When you look at the line item below, or the graph below, it's cumulative water uses and losses in a low flow year. So the uses shown above are still the same and as identified in the lower graph, but the cumulative water uses then are making up a larger proportion of the inflow into Lake Diefenbaker in any given year. So what we need to understand is that when we're talking about the cumulative uses here, this is providing those minimum downstream flows. It's providing for anticipated irrigation usage based on full uptake of the soils and usage within the west side in the Capel South Water Conveyance projects. And at that, we see that the usage is very similar to what is considered an inflow in a low flow year. A couple of things to consider when we're talking about this is that one, low flows on the South Saskatchewan River Basin are not necessarily related to drought conditions in Saskatchewan. And two, this does not take into account the water level as it exists in Lake Diefenbaker prior to any low flow inflows and what those basin levels and water levels are in Lake Diefenbaker. At the open house, we had a number of questions from people saying, well, the water levels is so low now, can this be supported? The answer is yes. One of the things that people have to recognize is that Lake Diefenbaker operating criteria will change with the presence of irrigation and a focus potentially more towards the water supply for irrigation and less on the requirements for power generation to meet SAS power requirements. All those things are being considered right now. and being evaluated not only by SaskPower but by Water Security Agency in a go forward plan of how the Lake Diefenbaker will be operated in the future. So in the median flow year, what are the percentages of the flows that are anticipated? Evaporation, as you can see in this pie chart, represents about 3% of the anticipated flows. 1% is released through the Capel Dam, about 1% for Eastside Pump Station, a couple percent for direct use, about 2% for the Capel South Water Conveyance Diversion, and the estimated West Side Irrigation Project diversion is about 3%. This is once again relative to what is considered a median year. So if we get into the situations that I talked to previously in terms of a low flow year, a median flow year, which would hopefully follow not too shortly after, would help to restore reservoir levels within Lake Diefenbaker. And certainly all of this is being assessed in more detail with hydrologic models and through Water Security Agency as this project is being developed. So what are we doing in terms of environment and environmental processes? Certainly environment is top of mind, not only for our project team, but the government as we move forward. There are many things that need to be assessed going forward, including heritage resources, which are archaeological and cultural resources, which are being assessed in terms of desktop studies and field surveys. We are looking at creating baselines for not only geotechnical, but also environmental, including fisheries and fish habitat in Cotto Bay, wildlife such as amphibians, mammals, and migratory birds, sensitive habitat such as wetlands and native prairie, and what are the impacts that this project is going to have on those baselines. Certainly, any project like this project is going to need robust regulatory approvals, and this project is no exception. Right now, we are uncertain in terms of what the regulatory requirements are that the project is going to need to abide by, but that is being discussed at the provincial and federal level. Certainly, there is much more requirements in terms of a regulatory standpoint to the Capel South Water Conveyance Project, which we're not talking about at this point, but with the downstream uses through the Capel, and there will be a higher level of scrutiny, and certainly that is believed to that it's going to require federal environmental approvals. In terms of the west side, the rehabilitation project may or may not require provincial regulatory approvals due to the fact that it's a pre-existing project, but that is being determined right now in terms of whether that it requires provincial approvals or federal approvals in discussions with both those agencies. The province has already designated or self-declared that the expansion project will undergo EIA or provincial environmental assessment processes just because of the status of that project and the greenfield nature of the project as it relates to the expansion project. So a lot of the current work is creating baseline information for those future environmental approvals, and certainly as more information is available in terms of locations, particularly in the expansion area of canals and such, more detailed environmental work will be undertaken on desktop and in the field to understand what those environmental constraints are and how we might address those going forward. So certainly all of the environmental considerations that we talked about will require some type of mitigation, and the types of mitigation required will be dictated by what we find. And certainly we're looking at working through discussions with First Nations and Métis, as I talked about initially, and through public consultation. We did have our first set of open houses in July. We are looking for a second set of open houses late November or early December, and then again likely in February, to bring back more information on the project as it's available, to inform the public and demonstrate the level of commitment that the project team and the government have to doing this project correctly and to the highest environmental standards that are out there. So certainly in terms of mitigation, we have to understand heritage resources, understand whether there are any heritage resources that we're going to need to intercept or work around. Certainly public safety around the structures, the balancing reservoirs, the canals, all of that needs to be understood and mitigated. Recreational impacts and benefits, if any, that are available for the project and how those might be incorporated. Wildlife and natural habitats, and as well as land stewardship. Certainly, we want to make certain that the project is developed to the highest standards so that we aren't leaking and salinizing existing soils. So we are looking to provide the design infrastructure to accommodate and mitigate any of those negative potential outcomes. Soil erosion and sedimentation are certainly going to be mitigated in the design through riprap or other hard surfacing to make sure that we aren't having negative outcomes from the water conveyance. Soil and water quality are being investigated, certainly agricultural production, and the outcomes of this certainly will be temporary planning and construction jobs and permanent operation and maintenance jobs. So design considerations, certainly irrigation and production improvements. How do we get the water on the land most efficiently so that we are making best use of the water that's available and not having negative repercussions of over-application? How do we minimize evaporation, groundwater percolation, and what other needs are there for emergency uses, recreation, power supply, and whether we need to maintain a navigable waterway. And certainly there's opportunities for direct use to communities if that is desired. So adjacent structures certainly include major utilities, road and rail crossings, and as I mentioned and shown previously, land access. We have to make sure that farming operations on both sides of the canal are maintained and that farmers have access across the canal at appropriate distances so that they can get to their land to continue their farming operations. So in investing in irrigation, here's a few facts that might be useful to try to understand why this project is beneficial. There is an estimated $23 billion increase in Canadian gross domestic product over the next 50 years from this project, and this value increases to 40 to 80 billion when you add the Qu'Appelle South Canal to the west side. It's anticipated that about 4.6 billion in tax revenues will be generated to support public services such as health, education, and social services. And certainly there's discussions that are ongoing right now with Indigenous communities in terms of how they can participate in the economic benefits of this project, either through employment, contracting opportunities, or other opportunities as it relates to the development of this project. It's anticipated that around 2,500 construction jobs per year will be required during the building phase, and certainly we're talking 10, 15 years, depending on the uptake and how the money becomes available for construction as we move forward. We are anticipating about $6.5 billion increase in personal incomes over the life of the project. and diversification of the province's agricultural portfolio, which could include table crops, as we talked about prior, or other value-added processes. Certainly, the protein sector would be supported by irrigation and the reliability of the crops generated through irrigation in this project. Climate resiliency is certainly an important fact. One of the things people may or may not understand is that a lot of food is generated in California, and much of it is supported not only by the Hoover Dam and Lake Mead, but also from underground reservoirs, large underground reservoirs that underlay the area. Certainly, these reservoirs are depleting, and there's already projections that much of the irrigation will need to be curtailed in California due to dwindling water supplies. This is an opportunity for Saskatchewan to fill a gap that is likely forthcoming in food production in North America, and to be a source of those foodstuffs for not only Saskatchewan, but Canada and North America as well. So we need to take that into consideration. One of the things that we show here is a timeline across the bottom of the graph. You will note that there are no interim dates on a number of these interim activities. The reason for that is we are still trying to determine what the regulatory processes are that we're going to need to follow. And certainly if we are following federal processes, the timelines will be pushed out because of the time required to comply with those federal processes. If the rehab does not need to follow federal or provincial processes, those timelines may be expedited. But one thing I want to make clear is that we are still very early in the design stage. And even if these processes are shortened, there is a timeline required for design, tendering, and initial construction. And we hope to be able to advise a little better about these timelines at subsequent open houses. But at the current time, we are awaiting further information about the regulatory processes and what we may need to comply with going forward. So that is a very quick overview of the project and what we're dealing with right now. And certainly, I would be willing to take questions, or Patrick or Jerry, to answer any questions you might have or more information you might like on this. Certainly, we also do have our project email, whipinfo@clifton.ca, where you can send email to, and there's the project website, which will have much of this information and will be updated regularly to provide increased information as it becomes available for the project as we go forward. So be happy to address any questions that you might have at this time.
Dwayne, thank you. It's Mike here. I don't know if you just want to pick off the questions between yourself and Patrick and or Jerry, but I believe a number of questions have been inserted into the chat. If you have access to seeing those.
Actually, Scott Grant is also on the meeting. If he could maybe assist with that. Scott, are you there?
I am, yes.
Yeah, maybe I'll stop sharing and we can just answer the questions here then.
Thanks, Scott.
So the first question was from Sean Graham regarding the type of soil testing methods that were used.
Jerry, do you want to answer that question, please?
Yes. Am I on there?
Yes, you are.
Okay, yes, we're actually the eyes and the feet for the Ministry of Agriculture, and we're using the irrigation suitability classification system that they developed in consultation with many irrigation and soil specialists. So we're out doing the work. So what we're doing in the detailed analysis for you, it's like we're putting it under an MRI each quarter section. We're doing EM38 grids, horizontal and vertical. So you go 2 feet and 4 feet measurements with the EM38 machines. We're doing them on 25 meters, 80 feet across the quarter of land. And then we're doing 4 punch holes, bore holes on a quarter section, and more if we feel it's necessary. And those holes are this 4-foot depth. So 1, 2, 3, and 4-foot depth. So we end up with 16 soil samples from 4 holes. And then we correlate them by georeferencing to the EM38 to make sure that the regression analysis is such that we can believe the EM38. So that's the type of soils work we do, and then send it off to the laboratory. And we're looking at many characteristics. One is to definitely want to determine if there's any variability in the texture layers going through the profile, and if so, what they are. We're also interested in SIA readings and electrical conductivity reading. Would be the 3 main ones we're looking at. So you're looking for, is it sodic, is it saline, are there lenses? And then we do LiDAR work to determine the topography, if there's limitations in topography, the slopes, for example, the relief, or if there's a simple slope or a complex slope, how much relief there is, if there's going to be a chance for horizontal infiltration rate problems like soil water ponding, because of various different soil textures not near surface, which is really important for an irrigation farmer to know that. And then with that LiDAR information, we also know what potential there is for surface drainage, if that is there, and the soil samples will tell you if there's potential for subsurface drainage, weeping tile, and you just recommend that a person pursue that. We're also interested if there's any off-site implications from or ramifications from irrigation, because if the water tends to be moving up by the LiDAR, we know there's a slope, and you could go to the neighbor's land and it's light land, there might be a movement of water, then we'll also rate it for offsite impact. So we're trying to get as much information as we can to an individual farmer to make his decision, his or her decision, and clearly the Ministry of Agriculture would issue the certificate. So if we said it's irrigation with precautions, and the precautions are require surface drainage at minimum, or there's the other thing there may be is if you have variation in textures within the profile or within the surface layer, more importantly, then perhaps they could consider a variable rate irrigation system that you can speed up and slow down and apply water to meet the needs of that land. So that's the level of detailed work that we're doing and providing that back to the farmer and the Ministry of Agriculture. And then, of course, from that, we can, through Clifton and our team, try to determine how many acres there are of class 1, 2, 3, 4 land, for example, for irrigation, which enables our team to know better what crops might grow and what potential there are in the various blocks that we're looking at. So that's a long answer, but it's a long job. So that's what I can tell you.
All right, thank you. Mike Solahub was asking a follow-up question to Sean's, and that what were the parameters of interest when determining irrigation suitability?
Well, the parameters of interest are soil structure, drainability, water holding capacity, salinity, acidity, geographic uniformity, for example. Those would be the soil ones. And then, well, texture is a big one, because you're really interested in texture. You can go, for example, the way they rate the soils would be, there's no limitations if it's a acidity loam, very fine sandy loam, no limitations. But if you go to soils that are heavy clay or loamy sand or sand dune, there are limitations. They would be called a 4, and the other ones I said would be a 1. So it's a scale of 1 to 4. So you're very interested in the texture to know the water holding capacity and the infiltration rate, and whether that irrigator will experience difficulty. Also, I would say on the landscape, so you do 2 things. Your also rating has the soils component and it has the topography component. You can't decouple those. And on that, we're looking with the LiDAR, and it's basically slopes and relief, how much variation is there within the quarter. If the person irrigates, will he have a lot of ponding? does he have a lot of, he or her have a lot of drainage to do to make that surface drainage to actually make it work. And I say the target area is another thing that we're concerned about, because we don't want to move a problem. If there's salinity, for example, in this light soil, and you can see that some drainage could occur, but then you just can't drain land willy-nilly. You need permits for surface drainage as well, which Patrick Bull could certainly talk about that. So all of those things are considered, and that information is given back. And then from a development standpoint, we would look at it as a team and try to create blocks that have a lot of a significant amount of land that could be serviced by water and would be potentially very beneficial to do so. Or you might limit a block that just simply, maybe for solonitic soil, heavy clays, or if you recommend drainage on a number of quarters, and we only look at each quarter as an individual basis without knowing the landowner, picking them that way. We do it on basically soil associations. But if we recommend drainage for a number of quarters in an area, then our engineering people would say, well, to irrigate that land, we must provide some surface drainage relief. Yes, it has to be built in, which is built in, for example, in SSRID number 1. You can drain land all over SSRID number 1 because a drainage system was built into the original design. So all of these things have to be considered to make a piece of land. We can say it's irrigable with precautions, but then the grower would have to look hard at the costs of those precautions. And so that's the information we give.
Okay, thank you.
One thing we have to make sure to state is that we are doing a representative number of parcels of land right now. So we're trying to estimate to the best of our ability what those limitations are in terms of irrigable land for the project. Certainly not every quarter is assessed, and each of them will ultimately be subject to an irrigation certificate or the need to acquire an irrigation certificate. The purpose of our testing right now is for the project team to understand what the magnitude of the available land is. So.
Okay, thank you. Can you go into a little bit more detail on the ecological impact studies that were done, and also any Indigenous advisors? Are they directly involved in the project?
Okay, ecological. Certainly, we have done a lot of desktop work, and we have been out in the field since the spring and monitoring impacts or the baseline information from an ecological standpoint. Certainly that is ongoing this fall. And as the structures and the infrastructure is determined, the final locations or what are perceived to be the recommended locations, more information will be gathered to further understand those ecological impacts and how we might mitigate them. I'm sorry, that may not be exactly what you're looking for, but that is what the status is right now.
Okay, thanks. The next question is from Bob Halliday. My understanding is only about 1/2 of the current irrigation capacity has been developed, and that 95% of that development was just for dryland crops. What evidence is there that the proposed development would lead to a different outcome?
I can take a bit of a stab at that.
Go ahead.
That's what everyone says. They believe that Saskatchewan just grows dryland crops and Alberta grows all the ones that are exciting. I think if you look at it closely, which we do, and I have done that in my career, has been irrigation farming, is that on the crop mix basis, on a percentage basis, last time I looked was the 2019 statistics of Alberta versus Saskatchewan on the crops that were grown. And the only difference, it might surprise everyone to know that we were growing about 20% of the acres on the 74,000 acres, the intensive acres, I better clarify. Lucky Lake, Riverhurst, Outlook, SSRID, Moon Lake, those areas that have a water available at all times so you could step out and grow special crops. Of those acres, 20% of them in Saskatchewan were special crops. In Alberta, 20% of them were special crops. people don't seem to know that, but that's exactly right. Alberta, Saskatchewan farmers have moved in lockstep when potential is available. So their specialty crops, the beauty they've got, and what Dwayne referred to earlier, is that they only grow 50,000 acres in Alberta out of 1.4 million, 50,000 acres of potatoes. But that services a fresh pack industry and 3 potato French fry factories and 2 chip factories. So the value added aspect of that 50,000 acres is absolutely huge. They're doing that. On our side, the other big thing Alberta's got going for it is the forage side, the livestock industry. They produce 70% of the cattle in Canada on feed are in Alberta, and that comes off of irrigation. So they got a huge amount of forage. 500,000 acres of the 1.4 are in forage crops related to the livestock industry, and they're crops that are alfalfa, barley solids, corn solids, pasture, same sort of thing that we can grow here. We are a lot larger on oil seeds. I give you that. Saskatchewan's higher in oil seeds, and the trade-off is Alberta's higher in forages. So a long story it is, but our farmers have moved forward as these crops are available. We grow dry beans here and potatoes in the Outlook area and the Lake Diefenbaker area have been the 2 crops that came in. But also people are moving to this area and always have and bringing their expertise along, which is why we've got the Little Potato Company producing their potatoes. If you buy Little Potatoes, you see them in nice little bags all over the country, all over Canada actually. They're coming from Outlook for people that moved here to grow little potatoes. People have moved here to grow carrots. 2 feedlot operators have moved here, Primrose family and Thiessen's out of Strathmore. Built feedlots here. So people will come here and develop the acres. A number of, and I know from the contacts I have, a number of investors are very much looking at this project and excited about it because the water shortages in other areas are creating a demand for what they produce, and this area can produce what they're looking for. So that's what's going to happen.
All right, thanks, Terry. Would there be any support programs to help growers convert to new crops if they want to move from dryland farming to irrigation?
Well, I can just jump in on that one, and that's really a question for the Ministry of Agriculture at this point in time. But certainly new program development with something that's magnitude of what comes is a conversation I think the ministry is looking at as it goes forward, right? And what does that look like in terms of the programming and ag cap funding, the Canadian Agricultural Partnership right now, and what does that look like in the future, right? So that's probably one we're looking at down the road, but certainly an active conversation.
Okay, thank you.
And in the past they have, and ladies and gentlemen, in the past they have, Ministry of Agriculture had a program to grow dry beans, introduce dry beans into this area, and also a program for potatoes. Introduced into the area. Back in the day for the dry beans, they actually bought equipment and rented it to the farmers and provided expertise. And the potato industry has been encouraged through the SPUTCO initiative, was the potato initiative that was to bring potatoes to this area. So there's some historical evidence that it's been in the past, and like Patrick said, it just comes. We'll see what it comes and what's needed in the future.
Okay, and how much government funding has been committed to the project now?
So from that perspective, I guess we're working through what that looks like on the funding model, and certainly the province here is committed to the west side and the project 1 right now. That's where the start is, and there's been an active conversation here that we're looking for a federal partner as we go along, as happened in the past with Alberta. So that continues on here, and I suspect we'll keep going on past September here. So that's probably some heavy conversations here after this September 20th date here with things. So I think that's something that continues on right now.
Okay, thank you. I'm just going to read the next one right off the screen here. In recent years, last decade, there have been more median flow years than low flow years. In low flow years going forward, where the usage is higher than allowable volume, what uses do you foresee would have cut to their allocated volume?
So just to answer this, and there's a whole, I'm reading through, there's a number of questions about flows and water quality, and you'll probably get the same answer over and over again here. So we might just bundle those together if we can. Just say in the interest of time as well. So, and I can start here, and then Dwayne, if you want to jump in a little bit too. But you know, looking at that, the flow conversation and water and how much, and obviously this year, water. You know, with the dry conditions in a lot of different areas is a topical conversation, but a lot of that study, you know, we're not at that point yet because we still need to do that work, and just to put you in the position of where we're at in the scope of the project is, you know, getting that information, looking at that impact, and what does that mean at the end of the day, and for the overall project. I mean, that's part of, you know, the project development as it moves forward here, and I think we'll keep looking at those things. But you know, at the end of the day, the reservoir itself was designed to do this, so we can't lose sight of what the purpose of Lake Diefenbaker was, and obviously with you know, looking at some of those changing climates. I mean, extremes on both ends is the conversation. So I mean, we're lucky to have the reservoir itself, but I mean, that's something we're looking at moving forward here. Dwayne, anything to add from your end?
Yeah, thanks, Patrick. The comment I would make is that a median flow year is representative of a median flow. I don't know the statistics of in the last 10 years, which has been how many above median and how many below. I know certainly there have been some flows in excess of median, that I'm certain of. But the proportion or the number of years above or below median, I can't comment on right now. I don't have that in my knowledge. One of the comments I would make was around allocation. There was a question about allocated volume if there was a shortage. Certainly personal consumption is highest priority. If there was a shortage, and it hasn't necessarily been demonstrated by the graphs that we showed, but if there was to be a shortage, it would be as it related to irrigation distribution. So environmental flows downstream, those apportionment agreements, personal consumption take priority. So I hope that answers your question.
Yeah, and keep in mind, allocation as it goes with every irrigation project is you need an allocation. So there's a permitting process for every producer they have to go through. So it's not as if the taps get turned on and that is just wide open, right? So it's there's various different levels that have to go that watch that closely as it goes. And with a multi-purpose reservoir like Lake Diefenbaker, I mean, that's those considerations. But we do know today, as far as how much water is available, I mean, there's roughly we're looking at it, 900,000 acre feet of water available in Lake Diefenbaker for allocation without impacting current operations. So this project, a full build out, you know, looking at 40 years down the road, it is forecasted to use somewhere in that 690,000 acre feet of water. So just a perspective. I mean, those are large things, but obviously you have to study that more, but that's just a basic information on it.
Yeah. And those were represented in that graph that I showed in terms of the consumption from the Capel South and the West Side Irrigation Project. That was full allocation and full usage.
Okay, thank you. Les, I'm going to adjust your question a little bit. What sort of consultation was held for producers in the local area? Les's question was, who's asked Milden and Delisle farmers with 10,000, 20,000 acres if they're interested in 100 pivots?
Well, I'll just jump in on that a little bit there too. I mean, part of what Dwayne mentioned previously in the open houses is a lot of that interest coming in, and particularly that Delisle area. It's a little bit farther out, but a lot of producers coming to that and talking to us about the potential and interest there. And then also something looking at the market and market sounding, and that's part of another study that's going on right now, and looking at that analysis of exactly what you're asking for there, Dr. Henry, is the interest out there, and are we moving forward? But that's part of the project development too, and what stage we're at. So we're probably not as far along as everyone here thinks we are at the end of the day, and that's early days in the project. So certainly it's a consideration right now, and I will say though, the interest that's been generated, I think, from the open house and what we heard from producers who came out to that was very supportive comments of looking for that. And obviously, as you get closer to Outlook and the history with the Macquarie district, interest there is even heightened, just based on what was built in the 1970s and then abandoned after that. So, Dwayne, anything you want to add there?
No, I think that's certainly appropriate. And like I said, there was a lot of support locally at Delisle and Outlook in terms of producers and a desire to get on with it. In fact, many of them were saying, how quickly is this going to happen? And but a comment that I will make is that the government and the project team are invested in doing this project correctly, that we answer the questions that need to be answered, and that we go through the processes, as I had mentioned, to make every drop count and to do this as sustainably as we can for the long-term benefit of the province.
Okay, thank you. Jerry, with the soil study, is there an opportunity, or did you take the opportunity to identify the potential for organic carbon sequestration?
No, we did not. No, we're going with the soil textures and what's out there, but we didn't get to the level that you're asking.
Okay. All right. Thank you. The next question is about, and I think you've addressed this, about the low flow years through the South Saskatchewan, but the concern is that the snowpack in the mountains is expected to be depleted within the century. So I'm going to change this a little bit. As you mentioned, balancing reservoirs, is it possible that you can capture more water than what's actually in the main reservoir itself through?
The comment I'd make is the balancing reservoirs are operational reservoirs. They're not really storage reservoirs for the purposes of the project. They're operational. Certainly, Lake Diefenbaker is intended to be the primary source and storage of flows. I will address the comment about climate change a little bit. Although there are some dwindling ice sheets in the mountains, some initial modeling, not from our team, but that I've heard of or seen of at different presentations, is that there may be a difference in the timing of the flow, but not necessarily a reduction in the overall flow in the South Saskatchewan River Basin. So those are things that are going to be assessed and evaluated more as we go forward. But some of the initial modeling does not necessarily result in reduced flows, or at least that's the information that I've had. I've received at certain presentations. So all of those things are being evaluated as the project goes forward.
Is all the data available that you use for some of the assumptions? Bob Tosh is asking the improved GDP, what sort of assumptions were used?
Well, a lot of the base information for that goes back to the Western Economic Diversification report that was completed in 2020. So that is the foundation for much of the GDP and economic numbers that are brought forward, and some modeling that was done back then.
Okay. And will all users have the same water quality? I'm assuming flow rates for the project?
Well, the water quality is all from Lake Diefenbaker. One of the things we need to do is manage the water quality throughout the system, but it is anticipated that the water quality would be similar for all users throughout the system.
Okay. So this is the province reviewing its foreign workers program, as well as communicating with the federal government if there's a move to more intensive production? And I think what they're getting at is the labor requirement for some of the products that you were outlining, some of the higher value products. they have a stronger labor component than dryland agriculture, than say a field of canola. Is the province reviewing any of the programs to enable the pickup of foreign workers?
I don't think anyone here can answer that question, and that might be down the road when you get to that point, and hopefully that's a problem that we have to address in the years to come here. So, but you know, that's something probably that would be looked at if that was the case, but you know, not close to where they're at right now at this stage of things.
Okay.
Yeah, I would like to comment on that. I think it will evolve as necessary. Again, using Outlook as the example, Barrett Farms and one of the market gardeners here have gone together and they put up, I think they've got about accommodation to 80 different people that can, 80 accommodation rooms in their trailer complex that they share. And that was all to bring in workers, and they've certainly made the process work. So I think it will evolve. There is history here. There is some knowledge on how to do it, and they can ask the right questions if there are limitations at the time they need it. But I say there are those that are already dealing with that situation in a pretty good way.
One last question that just came in is, will there be more focus on efficient irrigation methods, i.e. drip irrigation versus pivots?
Certainly the comment I'd make is that as it applies to individual farmers, I think they will pick the irrigation method that's suitable for the type of irrigating they're doing. But the presumption is that the most efficient water irrigation methods will be used for this project, and certainly in the delivery of the water to the individual farmers. So I would see that as being a focus of the project going forward, and certainly farmers will want to optimize their allocation as it applies to their crops and what they're going to grow. So I would anticipate that the most efficient distribution systems will be used.
Okay.
I would add, if you should spend some time at the CSID, Saskatchewan Irrigation Diversification Center, because we've done a lot of work there converting this Outlook area was originally designed for flood irrigation, gravity flood irrigation, and of the 35,000 acres, about half of it was gravity flood. It's now 44,000 acres, and there's 117 acres left in gravity. It's all been converted to sprinklers, low pressure sprinklers, and CSIDC has equipment there demonstrating variable rate irrigation, demonstrating the drop tubes and the types of nozzles that are available, and that has been readily accepted. In fact, the government had a program too, for a green program to enable some of the conversion, but it's been taken up continuously by the farmers. There's no question about it. If you look around this area now, I don't think you'll see a high pressure. I don't think there is a high pressure system on the project. They're all drop tubes. They're all low pressure, and you can vary the rate. They now have automated panels, so you can speed them up and slow them down based on different areas in the field that require different amounts of water applied. So the efficiency has gone up significantly in the last decade, and it's adopted.
Okay, thank you. One last question, and this is from me. Irrigation in Alberta is pretty close to the source. Irrigation in Saskatchewan passes through a lot of intensive agriculture, both in Alberta and in Saskatchewan. Has that been considered at all? Is there a workaround for that? What I'm getting at is the water that's coming out of the South Saskatchewan in Outlook, for example, is probably going to have a lot more in it than the water coming out of that they're using in Lethbridge, for example, for irrigation.
I'm not sure I can how to answer that one. Certainly, Alberta irrigation and any runoff that they have would be subject to environmental requirements, just like anything that we would have here in Saskatchewan. So one comment I would make is that the water quality within Lake Diefenbaker is still very good water quality. So I'm not quite sure about the context of the question. So
yeah, I guess just to add to that, Dwayne, there is constant monitoring that goes on amongst the Prairie Province's water board that looks at not only quantity but quality as well. So all those things are monitored and analyzed, and looking for trends or differences and changes. So if something was to change like that, we would be identified, particularly on the Saskatchewan side, because we watch that closely. And have those stations at the border, and then in Alberta, and we have access to their data. So just Prairie Province's water board is made up of Alberta, Saskatchewan, Manitoba, and the federal government, and we all work together on what that looks like. Not only what comes into the province, but then what leaves. So it's always an active conversation, I guess. And if something was to change like that, you know, that would be of significant concern to Saskatchewan because of the importance of Lake Diefenbaker, and not only in context of this project, but just with the multiple uses that it does provide, drinking water and all other uses out of the reservoir. So hopefully that answers that for you.
Okay, yeah, no, that's perfect. Thank you. That's it for questions. Dwayne, Jerry, Patrick, thank you very much for joining us today. We really appreciate it.
Thanks.
You're very welcome, and I look forward to many of your members or people online joining us at open houses as the project gets further developed.
And I sure hope all the Arctic agrologists enjoyed this. This is what you're becoming an agrologist to do, is to roll your sleeves up and get to work in the field of agriculture. So I hope you enjoyed this.
Fantastic. All right. Thank you very much. Have a great day, everyone. And we'll see you at the next event.